Miss Marple and Murder in Elmsworth. Chapter 1. The Stillness Beneath the Bridge. The morning mist clung low over the village of Elmsworth, turning the river into a winding ribbon of silver. The stone bridge that crossed it, built centuries ago and said to be haunted by an old toll-keeper, stood quiet and patient as if waiting. Few villagers ever looked twice at it. To them, it was part of the landscape, like the elm trees and the church steeple that pierced the autumn fog. At 7:30, young Peter Lacey, the postman's son, was cycling along the riverside lane with his fishing rod strapped across his back. His father's letters rattled softly in the basket. He often stopped near the old bridge before school, where he'd drop his line and dream of catching a trout big enough to impress his friends. That morning, though, something felt off. Even the birds were silent. Peter leaned his bicycle against the railing and peered over the mossy stones. The water was calm, too calm. Then he saw it. A shoe. Floating, turning slowly in the current, caught in the roots near the bank. And just beyond it, pale fingers tangled in reeds. Peter froze. For a moment he thought it was some cruel joke, maybe an old mannequin. But when the current tugged and the body shifted slightly, he saw the unmistakable outline of a face. He dropped his fishing rod, scrambled onto his bicycle, and pedaled so fast he nearly ran into Mrs. Hargreaves, who was on her way to the baker's. "Steady there, boy," she scolded, clutching her shopping basket. "There's someone by the bridge, someone in the water." Peter gasped. By noon, half the village knew. By 2, the constable had arrived from Brambleton, and by evening, every curtain in Elmsworth twitched as the gossip spread faster than the autumn wind. At St. Mary Mead Cottage, where Miss Marple had been visiting her cousin, the post brought her a short letter. It was from Mrs. Hargreaves, of course, urgent and underlined twice. "You won't believe it, Jane. A body found in the river by the old bridge. Everyone says it's poor Mr. Tillingham, the man who quarreled with his wife last week. The police are sure of it. Do come back quickly. It's dreadful." Miss Marple folded the letter, sighed softly, and looked out over the quiet village garden. The chrysanthemums swayed gently in the breeze, golden and white. "Murder," she murmured almost to herself, "or something that only looks like it." And with that, she began to pack her small blue suitcase. Chapter 2. Whispers in the Village. By the following morning, the whole of Elmsworth had turned into a restless beehive of speculation. The little square outside Hargreaves' tea shop was alive with murmurs, glances, and the clink of teacups held too tightly. The body pulled from beneath the bridge the day before had unsettled everyone. Not just because of the tragedy, but because it had happened here, in their peaceful, unremarkable village where nothing truly bad was ever supposed to occur. Mrs. Hargreaves herself had turned her tea room into what might as well have been a courtroom. Every table had its circle of talkers. Mrs. Giddings, the butcher's wife, who claimed to have heard raised voices 2 nights ago. Old Mr. Cooper, who insisted he saw lantern light by the river past midnight. And Mrs. Simmons, who knew someone whose cousin worked at the police station. They all agreed on one thing. The dead man was Mr. Harold Tillingham, late of Rosebank Cottage, husband to the anxious and pale Mrs. Clara Tillingham. "She hasn't come out since," Mrs. Giddings said, lowering her voice to a whisper. "I saw her curtain move early this morning, though. White as chalk she was." "Poor thing," muttered Mrs. Hargreaves. "But you know they did quarrel. The whole street heard. She threw a vase, or so they say." From her corner table, Reverend Pike cleared his throat disapprovingly. "Let us not jump to conclusions. The constable will know what to do." But even as he said it, his eyes darted toward the door, half expecting some new rumor to step in with the next customer. By midday, Constable Owens had confirmed the identity. Mr. Tillingham had been dead for nearly 12 hours before the body was found. Cause of death: a blow to the head with something blunt. No valuables were missing, and his watch still ticked faintly when retrieved. It was, as the constable put it, a curious case. That afternoon, Miss Marple arrived. She came quietly, without fanfare, a small suitcase in hand and a thoughtful look behind her spectacles. The villagers greeted her warmly. After all, she was familiar to many of them, having stayed with Mrs. Hargreaves several summers ago. But beneath the polite smiles, there was curiosity. Everyone knew Miss Marple had a way of noticing things. Over tea, Mrs. Hargreaves filled her in on every detail, including the color of the river, the weather, and what Mrs. Simmons claimed to have overheard from the constable's wife. Miss Marple listened without interruption. Her knitting needles clicked softly, steady as her breathing. "And you say," she asked finally, "that Mr. Tillingham and his wife quarreled on the night before his death?" "Oh yes," said Mrs. Hargreaves, leaning closer. Terribly loud it was. "About money, people think." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. "People often quarrel about money. But it's rarely the true cause of a tragedy. Tell me, did Mr. Tillingham have any friends in the village?" "Friends?" Mrs. Hargreaves frowned. "Well, he played cards at the pub, I suppose. Spoke often with that builder. What's his name, Mr. Roundtree?" "Interesting," murmured Miss Marple. "And his wife? Did she have friends?" Mrs. Hargreaves hesitated. "Not close ones. She was rather private. Spent much time walking near the bridge, they say." Miss Marple smiled gently and looked down at her knitting. "Near the bridge, you say?" "Yes, that's often where secrets like to linger." That evening, as twilight settled over Elmsworth and the church bells tolled 6, Miss Marple walked alone toward the river. The mist was creeping back across the fields, soft and pale like breath on glass. When she reached the old bridge, she paused. The constable had placed a small wooden barrier and a no-crossing notice. The water below moved sluggishly, as if weighed down by what it had witnessed. A folded newspaper drifted past her feet. Someone had dropped it earlier. On the back page, an article headline caught her eye. "Local builder wins council contract." And beneath it, a small photograph. Mr. Thomas Roundtree, smiling proudly. Miss Marple folded the paper carefully, tucked it under her arm, and turned back toward the village, her face unreadable. Chapter 3. The Man Who Smiled Too Easily. The next morning dawned bright, as though the weather itself refused to acknowledge the dark cloud hanging over Elmsworth. Children were on their way to school again. The milkman whistled. But under the surface, the village hummed with tension. Miss Marple took her breakfast in the small garden behind Mrs. Hargreaves' house. Marmalade toast, tea, and a view of the ivy climbing the brick wall. She had already spoken briefly with Constable Owens that morning. He was polite but visibly uneasy in her presence. Like most policemen, he found Miss Marple both endearing and slightly disarming. "We've everything in hand, miss," he'd said, adjusting his helmet. "Domestic quarrel gone wrong, most likely. We're keeping Mrs. Tillingham in care of her sister for now." "Yes, of course," Miss Marple had replied mildly. "I'm sure you are doing everything you can." Her tone, polite as ever, carried a subtle note of doubt that the constable could not quite place. After breakfast, she took a slow walk through the high street, pausing here and there to exchange a few words, seemingly idle but never without purpose. At the post office, she overheard Mrs. Simmons mention that Mr. Roundtree, the builder, had been strangely cheerful since the tragedy. At the bakery, someone else noted that he'd been seen talking quietly with Mrs. Tillingham the week before. And at the Green, Miss Marple herself saw him, broad-shouldered, pleasant-faced, his clothes dusted with lime and sawdust, laughing too loudly with a pair of workmen. When he saw her looking, he lifted his cap. "Good morning, ma'am," he said. "Terrible business, that. Poor Tillingham. But life goes on, doesn't it?" "Yes," said Miss Marple softly, her eyes resting on his cheerful expression. "Yes, indeed it does. Though not for everyone." He laughed lightly, not quite sure what to make of her remark, and turned away. That evening, back at the tea-room, the gossip had reached a fever pitch. Mrs. Giddings claimed that she had seen Mrs. Tillingham crying outside the church at dawn. Others said Roundtree had been in debt. Deep debt. Miss Marple listened to it all, quietly knitting. She wasn't interested in what people said, but in what they didn't say. And she had noticed something important already. No one seemed to know where Mr. Tillingham had been for the 2 hours before his death. Only one person perhaps might have known. And she was sitting alone now in Rosebank Cottage, the curtains drawn tight. Miss Marple set down her knitting, folded it neatly in her bag, and decided she would pay Mrs. Tillingham a visit in the morning. Chapter 4. A Widow's Story. Rosebank Cottage stood at the far end of the village, where the road dipped toward the meadow and the river curved away into mist. It was a small, trim house, whitewashed, with a climbing rose that had already lost most of its petals. Miss Marple arrived promptly at 11, carrying a small tin of shortbread as her excuse. Mrs. Clara Tillingham opened the door with red-rimmed eyes and an air of fragile dignity. She was pale, too thin, and her hands trembled slightly as she gestured Miss Marple inside. "Mrs. Hargreaves said you might call," she said quietly. I don't know what to say. It's all been so dreadful." Miss Marple took her hand gently. "I won't stay long, my dear. Just thought a bit of company might help. And I've brought biscuits." They sat in the small sitting room where the fire was lit, though the day was mild. On the mantel stood a photograph of Harold Tillingham, a solid man in his 40s, with a confident smile and eyes that didn't quite match it. "Your husband was well liked, I gather," said Miss Marple conversationally. Mrs. Tillingham hesitated. Yes, he was." She looked down at her hands. "He could be proud. He didn't like to be crossed." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. A very common trait, especially among men who have something to hide. Mrs. Tillingham's head jerked up. "You think he—" "Oh no, my dear," said Miss Marple calmly. "Only that people are not always what they appear. I've known many such cases." After a long pause, Mrs. Tillingham said in a trembling voice, "He'd been worried lately. About money. Something to do with a new bridge project in the next village. He said it was all settled, but I think he was afraid someone might find out something." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Yes. Secrets have a way of floating to the surface, even from under bridges." Mrs. Tillingham looked startled, then tearful. "You really think someone killed him deliberately?" Miss Marple rose and placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "I think, my dear, that the truth is seldom what it first appears to be, and sometimes the dead still whisper if one listens closely enough." As she stepped out into the misty lane again, she noticed muddy footprints by the garden gate. Large ones, not Mrs. Tillingham's. Fresh, though the morning had been dry. Miss Marple looked toward the river and saw a man standing by the hedge, pretending to fix a bicycle chain. It was Mr. Rowntree. She watched him for a moment, then turned away, murmuring to herself, "The man who smiled too easily is often the one with the heaviest heart." Chapter 5. Letters by the Riverbank. The mists of Elmsworth returned that night, curling low and heavy over the river like a secret unwilling to be told. The old bridge stood silent, its reflection wavering faintly in the moonlight. Only the sound of water against stone broke the stillness. Early the next morning, before the village stirred, Miss Marple walked down the narrow lane that led to the river. She had always preferred the quiet hours, when people's minds, much like the day, were just beginning to wake and often least guarded. She stopped by the spot where the constable had found Mr. Tillingham's body. A small cluster of withered reeds still bent in the water, and a faint depression marked the mud near the roots of the great willow. Miss Marple leaned on her parasol, studying the ground. She was not looking for the obvious. She never did. It was the little things that spoke most loudly to her. There, something half buried in the soil. She bent carefully and brushed away the mud. A scrap of paper, folded and water-stained. Part of a letter, the writing blurred but still legible in places. "Not meet again by the bridge. It isn't safe. I have done all I can, Tr." Miss Marple folded it delicately in her handkerchief. Tr, the initials fit Thomas Rowntree, the cheerful builder. She smiled faintly, though her eyes were sharp behind her spectacles. "Well," she murmured, "one must never underestimate how carelessly men dispose of their guilt." By 10 o'clock the village was awake again, and so were its tongues. Outside Hargreaves' tea shop, Mrs. Giddings had cornered poor Constable Owens with a list of opinions long enough to fill a newspaper. "I tell you," she said, "Mrs. Tillingham's hiding something. You don't faint at a funeral unless there's something to faint about." Owens sighed, rubbing his temples. "It's grief, Mrs. Giddings. People do grieve." Miss Marple appeared just then, serene as ever. "Good morning, Constable." Such a sad business, isn't it? Yes, miss, he said respectfully. Though I believe we'll have it settled soon. Mr. Tillingham's wife's story doesn't hold up too well. Indeed. Oh, but before you form conclusions, may I ask, have you examined the letters found in his jacket pocket? Owens blinked. Letters, miss. Miss Marple smiled softly. Ah, so none were found. She left him frowning and continued on her way, stopping briefly at the blacksmith's to ask about the bridge repairs Mr. Rowntree had been doing. She learned something curious. The council had not paid him for 3 months, owing to missing receipts. Strange, Miss Marple thought, that a man should be so cheerful when his accounts are in such disorder. That evening, she wrote a quiet note to Reverend Pike, requesting access to the church's parish records. She also penned another to Mrs. Tillingham, inviting her for tea the next afternoon. When she sealed the envelope, she hesitated for a moment. Then she slipped the river-stained letter inside her notebook and said softly, "One always begins with small things. Even murders often start with a note." Outside, the first raindrops began to fall on the cobbled street, and from far off, a single church bell tolled across Elmsworth. And under the old bridge, unseen by anyone, another scrap of paper, half torn, was lifted by the current and carried slowly downstream. Chapter 6. The Note That Shouldn't Exist. By the next afternoon, Elmsworth had returned to its uneasy rhythm. The sound of the milk cart clattering over cobbles, the distant whistle of the train, the murmurs at the tea shop, all seemed to carry an undertone of curiosity, as though the village itself were whispering, what really happened beneath that bridge? Miss Marple, seated by the bay window in Mrs. Hargreaves' sitting room, sorted through a few papers she had gathered over the morning. She was expecting Mrs. Tillingham at 3 o'clock for tea, and Miss Marple liked to be prepared, not with questions, but with listening. It was nearly 3:30 when Mrs. Tillingham arrived, her face still pale, her hands gloved even though the day was warm. "I must apologize for calling you," Miss Marple said gently as she poured tea, "but I thought it might be nice to have a little company. You've had a terrible week, my dear." Mrs. Tillingham gave a thin smile. "Yes. I hardly sleep. I see him everywhere. Harold was difficult, but I never wished—" She broke off, pressing her handkerchief to her lips. Miss Marple handed her a cup. "You poor thing. Tragedy unsettles one in so many ways. I wonder, did you ever receive letters from your husband's associates? Perhaps about his business dealings?" The widow hesitated. "Sometimes. He kept most things to himself. But there was one letter that came 2 days before his death. He hid it quickly when I entered the room. Did you happen to see the signature?" "Yes. I think it was Tr." Miss Marple's eyes, calm and blue, did not flicker. "Indeed. And may I ask, what became of it?" "I don't know," whispered Mrs. Tillingham. "After he died, the police found nothing in the house." "Nothing," repeated Miss Marple softly. "And yet, my dear, one always leaves traces. Letters, receipts, even whispers. The past rarely stays buried." That evening, after her guest had gone, Miss Marple walked to the vicarage with her small notebook in hand. Reverend Pike was in his study, surrounded by dusty parish registers and half-finished sermons. "Good evening, Miss Marple," he said, rising. "I hope you don't think I'm being unhelpful with all this dreadful business." "Not at all," she said kindly. "But I am curious. Do you recall a certain Thomas Rowntree attending services recently?" "Rowntree? Ah, the builder, yes. Only twice this year. Once last month, when he made a generous donation for the bell tower repairs." Miss Marple's knitting paused mid-stitch. "A donation, you say? How very public-spirited of him. Do you recall the amount?" £10, I believe. "In cash?" "Cash," she echoed. "Yes, that would explain quite a bit." Before leaving, she asked to see the ledger where the donation had been recorded. There, in neat handwriting, she found Rowntree's name, but also, curiously, another entry written beneath it in the same hand. Anonymous gift. £10, for the church's poor fund. Both entries bore the same date. 2 gifts, 1 giver, Miss Marple murmured as she closed the ledger. And yet, The good constable believes Roundtree hasn't been paid by the council in months. Very odd that generosity should flourish amid debt. When she returned home, the evening mist had thickened again. Mrs. Hargreaves had gone upstairs, leaving the downstairs quiet. On the little table by the window lay Miss Marple's notebook, and beside it, the river-stained letter she had found near the bridge. As she unfolded it once more, she noticed something she had missed before. The paper was torn unevenly, but the edge bore half a postal mark, the crest of the Elmsworth parish office. It hadn't been written on common stationery at all. This, Miss Marple said softly to herself, is not a lover's note, but a document, and one that was never meant to reach its destination. She replaced it carefully and turned down the lamp. Outside, the wind picked up, and through the window she could hear the faint creak of the sign from Hargreaves' tea shop swaying in the night. In the distance, somewhere beyond the fields, a dog barked once, sharp and sudden, then silence again, and Miss Marple, sitting quietly in her chair, whispered into the dark, "The note shouldn't exist, unless someone feared what it revealed." Chapter 7. The Shadow Beneath the Floorboards. It was a wet and uneasy morning in Elmsworth. Rain slid down the window panes of the tea shop, blurring the village square into a haze of movement and muted color. Mrs. Hargreaves clucked about with her mop and muttered, "All this damp, bad for the scones, bad for the spirits." Miss Marple, however, was perfectly content. Rain, she always said, made people careless. They hurried, they forgot to close doors properly, and they let their thoughts slip out in conversation. Rain, in her experience, was an excellent ally. She had been thinking a great deal about the letter, the one signed TR and marked with the crest of the parish office. If it wasn't personal, then it was official. And if official, it meant Roundtree had access to something he shouldn't. That thought stayed with her as she walked toward Rosebank Cottage later that day. She had a small excuse, a basket of muffins for Mrs. Tillingham, but in truth she wished to look. Mrs. Tillingham opened the door quickly this time, as though she had been standing behind it already. "Oh, Miss Marple, you shouldn't have troubled." "No trouble at all, my dear. I find baking rather calming in miserable weather. It keeps one from dwelling on unhappy things." The younger woman's eyes flickered away. "Yes, quite." Miss Marple set down the basket and looked around the sitting room. It was neat, but not naturally so, the sort of tidiness that came from recent nervous cleaning. The faint smell of polish hung in the air. "You've been busy," she remarked lightly. "I couldn't bear to sit idle. The constable said they might be finished with their search today." "Indeed," said Miss Marple, her tone mild. "They have been very thorough, I'm sure. Though I always think policemen look on things rather than into them." Mrs. Tillingham gave a strained smile. "I suppose that's true." Miss Marple stayed only half an hour, asking nothing of importance, yet noticing everything: the small patch of disturbed carpet by the hearth, the missing photograph from the mantel, and the faint trace of damp earth near the door, as though muddy boots had been hastily wiped away. When she rose to leave, she said kindly, "You've been brave, my dear. But do remember, guilt and grief can sometimes wear the same face." Mrs. Tillingham looked puzzled, but Miss Marple was already fastening her coat. That night, Miss Marple wrote a short note to Constable Owens suggesting that the late Mr. Tillingham's ledgers might be worth re-examining. Then, restless, she took her shawl and walked once more to the river. The rain had stopped, but the ground was still slick with mud. The bridge loomed ahead, silent and black against the faint glow of the village lamps. She paused by the willow where she had found the first letter. Something pale caught her eye again, a scrap of paper lodged against a stone. She bent, pulled it free, and gasped softly. It was another piece of the same letter. The missing half. Must keep it quiet, else they'll know about the council fund. The old records under the floor will give it away. Miss Marple folded it carefully. The old records under the floor. She turned toward the village hall at once. It stood empty and dark, but she knew the caretaker, Mr. Green, lived just opposite. A knock on his door and a kind smile was all it took for him to hand her the keys. "Just want to look at the donation records," she said cheerfully. "I do so hate loose ends." Inside the hall, her footsteps echoed softly on the wooden planks. It smelled of dust and varnish and forgotten meetings. She went straight to the far corner where a loose board had long creaked underfoot. She knelt, pried it up gently with the tip of her umbrella, and there, wrapped in brown paper, lay a small bundle of folded pages. They were receipts, signed by Thomas Rowntree and Harold Tillingham. Amounts of council money, large ones, recorded as construction costs, but never received. A faint smile touched Miss Marple's lips. So that's where the ghosts of Elmsworth keep their books. Just then, the door creaked open behind her. "Good evening, Miss Marple." She turned slowly. A figure stood silhouetted in the doorway, raincoat dripping, hat low over the brow. The hall's single lamp cast his face half in shadow, but the voice was unmistakable. "Thomas Rowntree." "You shouldn't be here," he said, his tone low and taut. "It's dangerous, poking into things that don't concern you." "Oh, but they do concern me," said Miss Marple pleasantly. "You see, I have a fondness for bridges, and for truth. They're both meant to bear weight without breaking." Rowntree took a step forward. "You've no idea what you've found, old woman." Miss Marple's voice was calm, almost pitying. "Oh, I think I have. Greed is such a tiresome motive, Mr. Rowntree. It always leaves muddy footprints." For a moment, the two regarded one another in silence, the rain whispering on the windows. Then Rowntree turned sharply and disappeared into the night. Miss Marple waited until the echo of his boots faded, then gathered the papers, replaced the floorboard, and smiled to herself. "The shadow beneath the floorboards," she murmured, "is always darkest just before the dawn." Chapter 8. The Visitor at Dusk. The day after Miss Marple's midnight discovery dawned with deceptive gentleness. The sun rose pale over the meadows, glistening on wet hedges and the sleepy rooftops of Elmsworth. Yet beneath the ordinary rhythms, the milk cart, the chiming clock, the chatter at the tea shop, something in the air had changed. A quiet unease, like the pause before a storm. Miss Marple, ever punctual, took breakfast with Mrs. Hargreaves as usual. The newspapers had carried the story of the bridge murder in a brief column now, neatly tucked between advertisements for hair tonic and bicycle lamps. Village builder questioned in connection with river death. Mrs. Hargreaves read it aloud twice, her voice shaking slightly. "Do you think it's true, Jane? That Rowntree man, do you think he really—" Miss Marple poured herself more tea. "I think, my dear, that truth is a very patient thing. It waits to be seen, even when everyone insists it's already visible." Mrs. Hargreaves blinked. "You do talk in riddles sometimes." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I find they help one listen better." That afternoon, the constable came to see her. He was damp from the rain, his notebook in hand, looking rather embarrassed. "I say, Miss Marple," he began, "I heard you were down at the hall last night. Looking into old ledgers, were you?" "Yes," she said calmly. "Quite fascinating parish bookkeeping. One learns so much about human behavior through arithmetic." Owens flushed. "Well, we've had a break-in this morning. The lock to the records room was forced. Nothing much taken, except an old box of receipts. You wouldn't happen to have seen anything suspicious?" She finished gently. "Yes, I might have. But tell me, Constable, was Mr. Rowntree in custody overnight?" Owens frowned. "No, Mississippi. We've been looking for him since dawn. He's vanished." Miss Marple's knitting paused mid-stitch. Vanished. How very inconvenient of him. By dusk, a light fog had begun to creep up from the fields again. Miss Marple sat by the window in Mrs. Hargreaves' parlor, her lamp glowing softly, her needles clicking with calm precision. But her eyes were elsewhere, watching the street. It was just after 8 when she heard it. A firm, deliberate knock at the door. Not hurried, not panicked. Measured. Mrs. Hargreaves called from upstairs. "Jane, would you get that? I've just put my hair in rollers." "Of course, my dear." Miss Marple rose, set aside her knitting, and opened the door. There stood Thomas Rowntree, hatless, coat soaked, eyes dark and restless. He gave a small, rueful smile. "Evening, Mississippi. I thought you might prefer to hear my side of it before the papers decide for you." Miss Marple regarded him steadily. "You're very bold, Mr. Roundtree. Coming here after what you've done." "I haven't done what they think," he said sharply. "I didn't kill Harold Tillingham." "Oh." She folded her hands, unafraid. "Then who did?" Roundtree stepped inside, lowering his voice. He was going to expose the whole thing. The council fraud, the missing funds, we both knew. But I swear when I left him that night, he was alive. And the letters. I burned mine. He was supposed to burn his too. But maybe he didn't. Miss Marple's expression softened slightly, though her eyes stayed alert. "Then you've made a dreadful mistake, my dear man. Because the river has a way of keeping what men try to destroy." He stared at her, breathing hard. "You've got one of those letters, don't you?" "I have." "And you've read it?" "I have." A tense silence. Outside, the church bell tolled 9. Then Roundtree said quietly, "You're not as harmless as people think, are you, Miss Marple?" She smiled. "Oh, I'm quite as harmless as I look, Mr. Roundtree. It's people's consciences that make me dangerous." Just then, a firm knock sounded again, from the back door. Roundtree froze. Miss Marple tilted her head. "You were followed." Constable Owen's voice called through the back garden. "Miss Marple? Everything all right in there?" Roundtree looked around in panic, then toward the front hall. "I didn't kill him," he repeated hoarsely. "But I know who did." Before she could speak, he slipped out through the side door, vanishing into the fog. Owens entered moments later, breathless. "Was that him?" "Yes," Miss Marple said calmly, settling back into her chair. "And he's more frightened of the truth than of the law. Which suggests, Constable, that someone else is far more dangerous than we've yet imagined." Outside, the fog rolled thicker, swallowing the lamplight. Somewhere beyond it, a man ran, and someone else watched him go. And Miss Marple, her eyes fixed on the mist beyond the window, whispered to herself, "The guilty seldom run toward freedom. They run toward desperation." Chapter 9. Footprints by the churchyard wall. Morning came gray and unsettled. The fog that had blanketed Elmsworth through the night was thinning now, curling around gravestones and low hedges like breath from a sleeping giant. The church bell tolled 7, and the echo drifted across the empty green. Miss Marple was already awake. She hadn't slept much. The image of Thomas Roundtree, pale, wet, and desperate, lingered in her mind. She had known fear before, but Roundtree's was different. It was not the fear of guilt, but the fear of knowing something he wished he didn't. She decided to walk before breakfast. Mrs. Hargreaves, having slept through most of the previous night's excitement, merely waved her off with a warning about damp air and delicate bones. The path behind St. Michael's Church was slick with dew. It led down past the old stone wall that bordered the graveyard, a wall half swallowed by ivy and thyme. Miss Marple walked slowly, her umbrella tapping lightly against the stones. That was when she saw it. Just beyond the lich gate, near the bend where the path dipped toward the vicar's garden, the ground was soft and muddy from the rain. There, clearly visible, were 2 sets of footprints. One deep and heavy, made by men's boots. The other smaller, finer, women's shoes, narrow at the toe, with a broken heel mark dragging slightly in the mud. Miss Marple bent down, examining them closely. The men's prints led toward the river path. The women's led away. And in between, pressed faintly against the earth, she saw something strange. The outline of a walking stick, but curved in a most unusual way. Not like the plain sticks most villagers carried, but the ornate kind with a carved handle, the kind belonging to a man who thought a good deal about appearances. "Curious," she murmured softly. "Curious indeed." As she rose, a voice startled her. "Good morning, Miss Marple. You're up early." It was Reverend Pembroke, tall, kind-faced, though his eyes that morning looked more nervous than usual. He carried a basket of tools, said he was tending to the church roses, though Miss Marple noted he had not a single thorn scratch on his gloves. "I find early hours very revealing, Reverend," she said gently, "before people begin pretending to be who they think they ought to be." He smiled uneasily. "You have such a way of saying things, Miss Marple. Always so observant." She turned to the wall. Tell me, Reverend, did you happen to know the late Mr. Tillingham well? Well enough, he replied. He donated generously to the church last year. He had a temper, though. I dare say that's common knowledge. Yes, she said softly. And tempers are rather like matches. They only serve their purpose once. He frowned, uncertain of her meaning. You think his death was not an accident? Miss Marple looked at him, her expression calm. I think, my dear Reverend, that the devil seldom uses obvious disguises. That afternoon, Constable Owens came again, looking both tired and worried. We found Roundtree's cap, he said, down near the mill path. Blood on it. We think he might have doubled back through the churchyard last night. Miss Marple looked up sharply. Through the churchyard? Are you quite sure? Yes. Prints all over. 2 sets, maybe 3. Hard to say with the mud. Ah, she said, her eyes narrowing slightly. Then you'd best check whether one of those sets belonged to a woman with a broken heel. Owens blinked. A woman. But there's no. There is always a woman, Constable, she said quietly. Whether in love, in jealousy, or in fear. That evening, Miss Marple sat once more by the fire, knitting in silence. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters. Mrs. Hargreaves bustled in with her nightly tea tray. Did you hear? The vicar's wife says she saw Mrs. Tillingham in the churchyard last night. Dressed all in grey. Like a ghost, she said. Miss Marple didn't answer right away. Her needles paused, glinting in the lamplight. Did she now? She said at last softly. Then the good lady saw not a ghost, but perhaps a conscience. And as she sipped her tea, her mind pieced the fragments together. Footprints, a broken heel, a walking stick too elegant for a builder, and a vicar who rose too early for a man who had nothing to hide. Somewhere among them, she thought, was not the story everyone told, but the truth no one dared whisper. Chapter 10. The Letter That Was Never Burned. It was raining again by morning, a steady drizzle that blurred the fields and made the cobbled streets of Elmsworth gleam like polished slate. The sort of rain that encouraged villagers to stay indoors, gossip from window to window, and wait for something, anything, to happen. Miss Marple, however, never minded the rain. It gave people excuses to stay home, and home was where people revealed themselves most truthfully. That day she carried her umbrella and a small parcel under her arm as she made her way to the late Mr. Tillingham's cottage, now shuttered and still. The constable had finished his inspection and given permission for Mrs. Hargreaves to fetch a few belongings for the widow, but Miss Marple had another purpose entirely. She had a question, not for the living but for the dead. The key turned stiffly in the lock. The house smelled of damp wood and pipe smoke. Dust lay thick upon the mantel, and beside the hearth, a chair stood slightly askew, as if someone had risen from it suddenly and never returned. Miss Marple moved quietly through the room, her eyes gliding over small details. A photograph turned face down on the side table. An ashtray with 2 cigarette ends, one half smoked, the other crushed with force. A single teacup on the tray, but 2 spoons beside it. Always tea for 2, she murmured softly. Even in solitude. Her attention turned to the bureau beneath the window. The drawers had been searched by police, but not thoroughly, she suspected. She tried the lower one, locked. A gentle tug. Nothing. Then, recalling something she'd once heard Mr. Tillingham brag about, his clever carpenter's lock, she smiled faintly, pressed on the drawer's edge and felt it spring open. Inside was a stack of old receipts, letters, and one small tin box marked Bridge Repairs Fund, 1936. The very project that Roundtree had mentioned. But tucked beneath the box, yellowed and slightly torn, was an envelope. The seal was half broken, as though someone had meant to burn it and thought better of it at the last moment. The handwriting was firm, deliberate. To be delivered only if I am gone. Miss Marple hesitated for only a second, then unfolded the paper. My dear friend, you will know by now that things have gone too far. I cannot undo what has been done, but I can at least make it known that the fault is not mine alone. The bridge funds, every penny was taken under the guise of renovation, but I have records that show where they truly went. The reverend, the builder, even a man from the council, they all took their share. I meant to tell the authorities, but I am afraid of what that will cost me. Someone has already warned me not to speak again. If anything happens, it will not be by chance. H. Tillingham. Miss Marple read the letter twice, her face unreadable. Then she folded it neatly and placed it in her bag. The church bell rang in the distance. 11 o'clock. As she turned to leave, she noticed something on the windowsill, a faint smudge of black wax. Candle wax. But the room held no candles, only a small oil lamp. Someone burned something here, she whispered. And very recently. She bent closer. Beneath the wax was a single hair, pale, fine, unmistakably blonde. Miss Marple straightened slowly, her expression tightening. Outside, she met Mrs. Tillingham, who was walking toward the gate, her gray coat drawn tight and her eyes red-rimmed. "Oh, Miss Marple," she began faintly. "They said I could fetch my husband's prayer book. I wanted something of his." "Of course, my dear," Miss Marple said kindly. "I was just leaving." Their eyes met, and for a brief instant Mrs. Tillingham's composure faltered. Her hands trembled as she adjusted her gloves, her gaze darting toward the river path. "I heard they found Roundtree's cap," she said quickly. "Poor man. He'll hang for it, I suppose." "Perhaps," Miss Marple replied gently, "though the river keeps more secrets than it gives away. And so, I find, do people." Mrs. Tillingham gave a small, forced smile. "You always did have a way of saying things, Miss Marple. I'm not sure if it's comforting or terrifying." "Both, I hope," said Miss Marple pleasantly. That evening, seated by the parlor fire, Miss Marple reread the letter, the candlelight flickering across her thoughtful face. The Reverend, the builder, a man from the council, and a warning not to speak again. 3 men, 1 woman, 1 bridge. Outside, the rain fell harder, tapping on the window like fingers impatient to be let in. Miss Marple folded her hands and whispered, "When people conspire, it is rarely for evil's sake alone, but for fear of what the truth will take from them." She looked toward the river's direction, invisible beyond the mist. "Now, Mr. Tillingham," she said softly, "let's see who wanted you silent." Chapter 11. Tea at the Vicarage. The rain had stopped by mid-morning, though the sky still hung heavy and low over Elmsworth. The streets glistened, the river steamed faintly, and the church bell sounded softer than usual, as if reluctant to disturb the hush that had settled over the village. Miss Marple walked up the narrow path to St. Michael's Vicarage, her umbrella closed now, her handbag neat and precise under her arm. The garden smelled of wet roses and coal smoke. She paused at the gate, noticing fresh boot marks in the mud. 2 sets again. 1 large, 1 small. The door opened before she could knock. Reverend Pembroke stood there, pale and courteous, a faint smile masking what his eyes could not hide. "Miss Marple. What a pleasant surprise. You must come in. Mrs. Pembroke has just set the kettle." "Thank you, Reverend. I do find a cup of tea solves more puzzles than most men with magnifying glasses." He chuckled nervously. "You do have a way of putting things." The vicarage sitting room was warm, faintly scented with lavender polish and damp in books. Mrs. Pembroke, a quiet, fragile-looking woman, poured the tea and offered sponge cake with a polite tremor of her hand. "I heard such dreadful things," she whispered. "They say Mr. Roundtree's run off. And that poor Mr. Tillingham. How shocking, how awful for his wife." Miss Marple stirred her tea. "Yes, quite dreadful. But grief takes strange forms, don't you think? It can make the guilty tremble and the innocent act quite madly." The Reverend's teacup clinked faintly as he set it down. "You're suggesting guilt, Miss Marple?" "I'm suggesting," she said softly, "that money meant for bridge repairs somehow found its way into other hands, and that the man who threatened to reveal it ended up in the river." A silence fell. Only the clock ticked, steady as a heartbeat. Mrs. Pembroke looked from her husband to Miss Marple, confusion clouding her delicate face. "I don't understand. What do you mean?" Miss Marple smiled gently. "I mean, my dear, that Mr. Tillingham's letter speaks of 3 names, the builder, a man from the council, and the Reverend himself." Mrs. Pembroke's hand flew to her mouth. "Edward." But Reverend Pembroke was already standing. "That's quite enough," he said sharply. "Those are vile accusations. I've served this parish faithfully for 20 years. Miss Marple's tone remained calm, her eyes kind but unwavering. "Of course you have. And yet, someone convinced you to borrow against the bridge fund. Didn't they? To cover another debt, perhaps something owed to the church renovations." He hesitated. The denial came too late to sound convincing. "You don't understand," he said quietly. "It was meant to be temporary. Rowntree suggested it. Tillingham agreed at first, but then he wanted to go to the authorities. And so," Miss Marple said gently, "someone warned him not to speak again." Pembroke's eyes flickered toward his wife. "I didn't harm him. By God, I didn't." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "I believe you, Reverend. But someone used your guilt to ensure your silence. Someone cleverer and colder." As she rose to leave, Mrs. Pembroke caught her hand. "Please," she whispered. "If Edward didn't kill him, who did?" Miss Marple looked toward the window, where raindrops traced faint lines across the glass. "I don't yet know," she said. "But whoever it was, they were close enough to know his fears and brave enough to make use of them." She gave the Reverend a look both kind and piercing. "I should keep the church locked tonight, Reverend. Secrets have a way of finding their way to the altar." Outside, the air was cool and clean. Miss Marple paused at the church gate, her mind turning over the puzzle in neat, careful order. Mr. Tillingham had written that someone warned him. That meant a meeting or a message. And if it was a message, it would have been delivered discreetly, perhaps through the church post or a private note. She recalled the faint black wax she'd seen on the windowsill of Tillingham's cottage. The vicar's candles used the same wax, imported from London for special services. But what of the blonde hair? Miss Marple frowned slightly. Mrs. Pembroke's hair was pale, nearly golden. But so was Mrs. Tillingham's. "Two blondes," she murmured. "And only one confession waiting to be spoken." That evening she returned to Mrs. Hargreaves' parlor, where the fire glowed softly. The letter lay on her lap, folded neatly. She spoke half aloud, her tone thoughtful. "There are 3 men in this affair and 2 women, but only one bridge, and only one lie holding it all together. Sooner or later that lie will crumble, and the river will speak." Chapter 12. The Midnight Confession. By evening, the weather had turned wild again. The wind rattled the shutters of Mrs. Hargreaves's cottage, and the rain came in fierce, slanted sheets against the panes. The village of Elmsworth was almost unrecognizable, its tidy hedges bowed by wind, its cobbles awash with silver puddles that reflected trembling lamplight. Miss Marple sat by the fire, knitting in her usual calm rhythm, though her thoughts were anything but tranquil. On the small table beside her lay Mr. Tillingham's letter, a candle guttering beside it. Each time the wind rose, the flame flickered, and the shadows trembled across the page, as if the dead man himself stirred beneath her lamp. She had pieced together most of it now: the stolen bridge funds, the Reverend's reluctant involvement, and the missing records. Yet one question persisted like a whisper in the storm. Who had silenced Harold Tillingham? At 11:30, just as she was considering bed, there came a knock at the door. Not timid, urgent. Mrs. Hargreaves called faintly from upstairs. "Jane, whoever that is, don't open it. It's a dreadful night for visitors." But Miss Marple already had her shawl around her shoulders. "It's precisely dreadful nights that bring the most revealing company," she murmured. She opened the door to find Mrs. Tillingham standing there, drenched, pale, her hair undone, and her eyes wide with something between fear and resolve. "Please," she gasped. "I couldn't sleep. I had to speak to someone before it's too late." "Of course, my dear," said Miss Marple gently, guiding her inside. "Sit down. You must be frozen." Mrs. Tillingham clutched at her sleeve. "They think Thomas Rowntree killed my husband. They're wrong. But if I tell the truth, they'll hang someone else. Someone I can't condemn." Miss Marple poured her a small glass of sherry and waited. The silence stretched, filled only by the tapping of rain against the window. At last, Mrs. Tillingham began to speak, in a low, trembling voice. "I loved Harold once," she said. But he changed. After the bridge project began, he was cruel, suspicious. He thought I knew something about the missing money, though I never asked about it. Then one night, I found him by the fire, burning papers. He told me never to mention what I'd seen. Her hands twisted the edge of her handkerchief. The next evening, I went to the church. I thought Reverend Pembroke might talk to him, calm him down. But Harold followed me there. He accused me of betrayal, of lying. There was such fury in him, Miss Marple. He struck the table, shouting that if he went down, we'd all go with him. She stopped, trembling. Then Thomas came in. I don't know why, he must have followed too. The men argued. I left them there, shouting at each other. And after that, Miss Marple asked softly. I went home. I thought they'd both cool off. But later, after midnight, I heard someone at the window. I went to the door, and there was Harold's walking stick, broken in half, lying on the step. Her voice broke. I knew something had happened. But I didn't go to the police. I was afraid. Afraid of what, my dear? Mrs. Tillingham hesitated. Then, in a whisper, afraid of who told him I'd been at the church in the first place. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. And who told him? Mrs. Tillingham's lips trembled. Someone I trusted. Someone who said he wanted to protect me. The storm howled outside. The candle flickered dangerously low. Miss Marple spoke gently, as if to a child. Then that is your confession, my dear, not of guilt but of silence, the kind that keeps wickedness breathing. Mrs. Tillingham's tears fell freely now. I don't know what to do. They'll find Roundtree before dawn, and they'll say it's him. Miss Marple rose, her movements deliberate and calm. Then before dawn comes, we must find the proof that speaks for the dead. She took the letter from the table and pressed it into Mrs. Tillingham's trembling hands. Read it. All of it. And tell me if the man who wrote these words deserved to die, or if someone decided that his truth cost too much to be heard. Mrs. Tillingham's eyes filled as she read. Oh God, she whispered. I didn't know. I thought it was just the Reverend and Thomas. But this says, Yes, said Miss Marple softly. It names another. The man from the council. The one who ordered the bridge inspection and signed the disbursement papers. Mrs. Tillingham's voice caught. Mr. Vale. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Mr. Vale, who also happens to be your late husband's oldest friend. The clock struck 12. The storm outside began to ease, but the air inside the cottage felt heavier, closer. Mrs. Tillingham looked up, her face pale but resolute. If you think he did this, you must stop him, Miss Marple, before anyone else dies. I intend to, Miss Marple said quietly. But first, we shall pay a visit to the council office in the morning, before the clerk begins his workday. She rose and set another log upon the fire. Go home now, my dear. Change your dress. And for tonight, lock your doors. The truth has a way of knocking back when it feels cornered. When the door closed behind her visitor, Miss Marple stood for a long time before the dying fire, her reflection wavering in the dark window-pane. There it is again, she murmured. Fear, dressed up as loyalty. That's how evil keeps its friends. And as the wind fell silent, Miss Marple's thoughts moved ahead to morning, and to a certain man in an office who thought his secrets still safe beneath ink and ledger lines. Chapter 13. The Council Clerk's Ledger. Morning came pale and cold, the rain having spent itself in the night. A low mist clung to the ground, turning Elmsworth village green into a ghostly stage where even the sparrows seemed hesitant to chirp. Miss Marple, wearing her dove-gray coat and a small felt hat, walked briskly toward the parish council office, her knitting bag tucked beneath one arm. Behind her trudged Constable Owens, his collar turned up, his boots squeaking in the damp. Forgive me, Miss Marple, he muttered. But if you're right about this Mr. Vale, it means the whole bridge fund affair was a sham from the start. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Oh, my dear Owens, I've seldom seen a crime begin as murder. It usually begins with something far more respectable. Paperwork. The council office was small and neat, smelling faintly of dust and old ink. Files stood in ordered rows, and a narrow window looked out upon the gray lane. At a desk sat Mr. Harold Vale, a large man with thinning hair and a fixed oily smile. "Well, if it isn't Miss Marple of St. Mary Mead," he said pleasantly. "And Constable Owens. What brings you to our humble den of bureaucracy?" "Just a little inquiry," said Miss Marple, with that air of innocent politeness that made men like Mr. Vale underestimate her immediately. "We're reviewing the old bridge account, after poor Mr. Tillingham's tragic passing. I wondered if you might help us locate a ledger or two." Mr. Vale chuckled. Of course. Though most of those documents were lost in the fire at the storehouse last month. Quite a pity." "Ah, yes," Miss Marple said softly, her eyes drifting over the office shelves. "So many unfortunate fires lately." Owens shifted awkwardly. "If it's all right, sir, I'll just have a quick look through the ledgers in the back room." Mr. Vale hesitated. "I suppose that's fine, Constable. But you won't find much of interest." While Owens disappeared into the adjoining records room, Miss Marple lingered by Mr. Vale's desk, admiring the rows of leather-bound volumes. Her fingers traced lightly along their spines until she paused at one marked 1937 to 1940. Disbursements and approvals. "Oh dear," she said. "This one's rather out of place, isn't it?" Mr. Vale looked up sharply. "Oh yes, that old thing. Hardly relevant now." "Still," Miss Marple murmured, "old things can be surprisingly resilient, like truths that refuse to stay buried." She lifted the ledger, its cover worn and corners stained. When she opened it, the entries appeared ordinary. Expenses, permits, council wages. But halfway through, something caught her eye, a series of identical signatures, neat and practiced, all approving payments to the Elmsworth Bridge Initiative. "Such fine penmanship," she said. "Though one might say too fine. A pity Mr. Tillingham's hand trembled in his last year. Yet here his signature is, steady as the day he first took office." Mr. Vale's voice hardened. "Are you suggesting forgery, Miss Marple?" "Not suggesting, Mr. Vale," she replied mildly, closing the ledger. "Merely observing. Observation is the backbone of small-town life. Wouldn't you agree?" Just then, Owens returned, holding a slim folder. "Found this tucked behind the safe, sir. Shall I?" Mr. Vale snatched it from him. "That's private council property." But Miss Marple's sharp eyes had already glimpsed the label. "Bridge repairs, interim receipts." "I do beg your pardon," she said sweetly, "but I believe those receipts were submitted after Mr. Tillingham's death." Mr. Vale paled. "Nonsense." "Indeed. Then perhaps you can explain," she said gently, "why the first receipt bears a date 2 days after the Reverend reported the body found, and bears your own signature beside the deceased's." The silence that followed was thick and dangerous. Owens looked from one to the other. "Sir, is that true?" Mr. Vale's hands trembled. I don't recall. Perhaps the dates were entered wrongly." Miss Marple's voice cut through like the click of knitting needles. "Mr. Vale, in my experience, men rarely make mistakes that benefit others. Only the ones that protect themselves." A heavy minute passed before he sank into his chair, defeated. "You've no proof," he muttered. Miss Marple smiled kindly. "On the contrary, you've just provided it. For men who forge signatures seldom tremble, until they're caught." She turned to Owens. "I believe this ledger and those receipts should be taken to Inspector Graves. Quietly, if you please." Mr. Vale's face went chalk white. "You've ruined me, you interfering old woman." "Not at all," Miss Marple said gently. "I've merely stopped the ruin from spreading any further." Outside, the fog had begun to lift, the first hints of sunlight touching the village roofs. Miss Marple stood on the council steps, adjusting her gloves. Owens exhaled. "You knew it was him from the start, didn't you?" "Not at the start," she said, smiling faintly. "But one learns to notice patterns, whether in lacework or in lies." As they walked away, the church bell struck noon, slow, solemn, and clear across the green. And though justice was yet incomplete, Miss Marple felt the first clean breath of truth stirring the air. Chapter 14. Footprints in the vicarage garden. The rain had stopped, but the air still held that soft, earthy scent of wet soil and moss. Over Elmsworth, the morning mist drifted lazily across rooftops, thinning now to a silvery haze. Miss Marple stood by the vicarage gate, her gloved hands folded neatly around her umbrella. To the casual observer, she might have seemed an old lady admiring roses. In truth, she was watching footsteps. The Reverend's garden stretched behind the church, a carefully tended maze of flower beds, flagstone paths, and low hedges. And yet, as Miss Marple's sharp eyes followed the irregular marks in the soil, the perfection of that order began to fray. 2 days before, she had noticed one set of footprints leading toward the back hedge, a man's broad-soled, fresh after the rain. Now there were 3, 2 heavier, 1 light and small. The lighter ones turned sharply halfway down the path, as though their owner had paused or hidden. She took a step closer. Something caught the light. A small silver button, half buried in the mud. Miss Marple bent carefully, lifting it between 2 fingers. It was engraved with a narrow crest, the same design that adorned the cuff of the Reverend's visiting coat. "Ah," she murmured. "The threads begin to tangle." She was not alone long. From the vicarage door emerged Mrs. Pembroke, the Reverend's wife, pale and anxious, her shawl drawn tightly about her shoulders. "Miss Marple. Oh, you startled me. You're out rather early." "So are you, my dear," Miss Marple said gently. "The early morning is a good time for reflection." Mrs. Pembroke's smile faltered. "If you're looking for the Reverend, he's gone to visit the Tillingham estate, to offer condolences." "How thoughtful," said Miss Marple. "Though I should think the late Mr. Tillingham's widow might find other visitors less comforting just now." Mrs. Pembroke blinked. "What do you mean?" Miss Marple studied her face for a moment. Only that grief and guilt are such similar emotions, so difficult to tell apart, unless one has spent a lifetime observing both. The vicar's wife turned away, visibly shaken. "You can't possibly think—" "I think," Miss Marple interrupted softly, "that secrets often grow like weeds in tidy gardens." That afternoon, Miss Marple visited the church once more, where Constable Owens waited by the porch, his notebook already open. "You wanted to see the footprints, ma'am?" "Indeed," she said, pointing to the garden path. "Note the stride, Constable, long, deliberate, yet careful at the edges. Whoever walked here last night was not a frightened man, but one accustomed to sneaking about unseen." Owens squinted. Could be the Reverend himself, checking his grounds. "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, her eyes fixed on the marks near the hedge. "But tell me, do you see that small patch where the footprints overlap?" Owens leaned down. "It looks like 2 sets. Heavy ones and lighter ones on top." "Precisely," said Miss Marple. "That tells us something quite important. The lighter prints came after the heavier, meaning someone followed our Reverend, rather than walked with him." Owens frowned. "Followed him? At that hour?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Jealousy, Constable, keeps the strangest hours." By dusk, Miss Marple returned home, the silver button now cleaned and resting beside her teacup. Mrs. Hargreaves was bustling about, muttering gossip about the vicar's late-night meetings and how Mrs. Pembroke had been seen crying behind the vestry. Miss Marple said nothing. She simply looked into the fire, her needles moving rhythmically, her thoughts sharper than steel. A forged ledger. A frightened clerk. A vicar who lied about where he'd been. And now, a silver button torn from his coat, found at the scene where someone had met another in secret. The web was tightening. She looked up suddenly, her eyes bright. "Mrs. Hargreaves, would you be so kind as to fetch me that small lantern from the hall cupboard?" "Lantern, ma'am? At this hour?" "Yes," said Miss Marple softly. "I believe I shall pay a visit to the churchyard tonight. It's time I saw where the truth prefers to hide." Chapter 15. The Lantern in the Churchyard. It was close to midnight when Miss Marple left her cottage. The sky hung low and moonless, the clouds thick as wool. Only her small brass lantern cut through the dark, its glow a trembling pool of gold against the black. She walked briskly towards St. Michael's Church, her footsteps muffled by the damp earth. Every window in the village was dark. Only the faint creak of branches and the distant cry of an owl broke the silence. She had told Mrs. Hargreaves she was merely going to check the roses by moonlight. A small lie, but a necessary one. For Miss Marple knew that, by morning, there might be no more secrets left to hide. When she reached the churchyard gate, she paused. The air smelled faintly of whetstone and lilac. In the stillness, even her breathing sounded too loud. She lifted the lantern higher and began to follow the narrow path between the gravestones, toward the old yew tree that stood like a sentry at the corner wall. Beneath that tree ran the path that curved down to the riverbank, just beside the old bridge. It was there that Mr. Tillingham had been found, and it was there, Miss Marple suspected, that the last act of deceit had been played out. The mud was soft again, still marked by footprints from days before, half washed away, half preserved. She knelt, holding the lantern close. There, the same tread she'd seen in the vicarage garden. The Reverend's. Long, deliberate steps. And beside them, another. Smaller. Lighter. A woman's. She followed the tracks slowly until her light caught on something glinting in the mud. A fragment of glass, small and curved. She picked it up. It was part of a lantern pane, the same shape and brass trim as those used in the vicarage store. One corner was smeared faintly red. Blood, she whispered. Her heart gave one sharp beat, but she didn't falter. Instead, she turned toward the bridge and saw movement. A shadow detached itself from the darker line of trees. "Who's there?" she called softly. No answer. Then a voice, low, trembling. "Please, Miss Marple. Don't come any closer." It was Mrs. Pembroke. Her face was pale, her shawl soaked, her eyes wide with fear. "Good heavens, my dear," said Miss Marple quietly. "You'll catch your death of cold." Mrs. Pembroke took a step forward. "I didn't mean for it to happen. I swear I didn't. But he said he'd ruin us both." Miss Marple lowered her lantern slightly. "You're speaking of Mr. Tillingham?" The vicar's wife nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. "He found out about the ledger. Harold Vale was supposed to destroy it, but the Reverend, he kept a copy. Said it would protect the church's reputation. But Tillingham, he wanted money. Said he'd expose them all unless I helped." Miss Marple's face remained calm, but her voice softened. "And so you met him? Here? That night?" "I only meant to reason with him," she sobbed. "But the Reverend followed us. There was shouting, he pushed Tillingham and he fell." The silence that followed was terrible. The faint ripple of the river was the only sound. Miss Marple stepped closer. "You mustn't stay here, my dear. Go home. Tell your husband I know everything and that by dawn the truth will come out, in whatever way it must." Mrs. Pembroke stared at her helplessly. "He'll be ruined." "Perhaps," said Miss Marple gently, "but better ruined in this life than condemned in the next." Mrs. Pembroke gave a broken sob and fled into the night. Miss Marple watched her go, then turned her gaze once more to the dark water under the bridge. There, glimmering faintly where her lantern's light reached, lay a second shard of glass, larger, with a smudge of ink across one corner. And just visible beneath it, the edge of a torn paper, half buried in mud. She bent, tugged it free, and read the faint, fading words. "Will expose the Reverend's false accounts if not paid by Sunday." Her eyes narrowed. "So that's your secret, my poor Tillingham," she murmured. "You meant blackmail, not confession." The bell in the church tower struck once. Miss Marple turned, her lantern flickering in the wind. Somewhere in the distance, a door slammed, the sound echoing through the sleeping village. She drew her shawl tighter, her mind already fitting the final pieces together. A vicar with forged accounts. A clerk who obeyed orders. A blackmailer silenced beside the bridge. And a wife who carried guilt heavier than any sin. By morning, she thought, there would be justice. Quiet, merciful, and complete. She blew out her lantern. Chapter 16, Confession at Dawn. Dawn came gray and pale over Elmsworth village, the sky the color of worn linen. Mist still clung to the hedgerows, softening the sharp lines of cottages and chimneys. Inside the vicarage, a single lamp burned, faint, flickering, in the drawing room. Miss Marple stood near the hearth, her hands folded on the head of her umbrella. Her expression was mild as ever, but her eyes, sharp and full of quiet sorrow, never left the man before her. The Reverend Pembroke sat in his armchair, his robe rumpled, his eyes hollow from sleeplessness. Beside him, Mrs. Pembroke knelt, clutching his hand as if it were the last anchor between them and ruin. On the small table lay the items Miss Marple had found: the silver button, the bloodied glass shard, and the torn blackmail note. "I think," Miss Marple began softly, "we might speak quite frankly now, don't you?" The Reverend closed his eyes. "My wife has told you everything, then?" "She has told me enough," Miss Marple replied. "But I should prefer to hear it from you. Truth has a way of changing tone depending on who speaks it." He bowed his head, his voice low and uneven. "It was an accident. I swear before God it was. I went to meet Tillingham only to persuade him to stop. He'd discovered the false ledgers, Vale's doing, not mine, though I allowed them to continue out of fear the parish would suffer. Tillingham threatened to expose us all. He wanted money, a large sum I could never pay." He rubbed his temples, trembling. "When I found him at the bridge, he was already drunk and raging. My wife had gone ahead to plead with him, but he struck her. I intervened, pushed him away, and he stumbled. He lost his footing and fell." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "And you did not call for help?" He shook his head, tears welling. "It was too late. He struck his head on the stones below. I panicked. I told my wife to go home. I thought, if we said nothing, perhaps it would be taken for misfortune. And then Vale promised to burn the papers. But he blackmailed me in turn." Miss Marple sighed, almost tenderly. "Fear, my dear Reverend, is a poor companion to faith." At that moment, Inspector Graves entered the room, guided by Constable Owens. The inspector's face was grave but not unkind. "I've heard enough," Graves said quietly. "You understand, sir, that I must take your statement officially." "Yes," the Reverend whispered. "I understand." Mrs. Pembroke let out a quiet sob. Miss Marple placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "It will not be as terrible as you imagine," she said softly. "Truth rarely is. Lies, on the other hand, have a dreadful way of rotting everything they touch." As the inspector led the vicar from the room, Miss Marple remained by the fire. Outside, the first sunlight was filtering through the mist, touching the vicarage garden, the same garden where she had found the footprints and the silver button. Mrs. Pembroke sat silently, her eyes fixed on nothing. Miss Marple looked at her kindly. "You are not the first woman to protect her husband's pride at too high a price, my dear. But I hope you will be the last to suffer for it." Mrs. Pembroke's lips trembled. "Will they hang him?" Miss Marple shook her head gently. "Not for an accident confessed with a clean heart. The law is sterner than it used to be, but still not without mercy. And mercy, Mrs. Pembroke, is what he must now learn to ask for properly." When Miss Marple finally stepped out into the cold morning air, the village seemed to be waking, a milk cart rattling down the lane, smoke curling from the chimneys. Life, as it always did, was moving on. She paused by the church gate and looked once more toward the old bridge. The mist had thinned there, revealing the worn stone arch glistening in pale sunlight. How ordinary it looked, and how much sorrow it had held. She sighed, drawing her shawl close. "People do so many foolish things," she murmured to herself, "all from such very ordinary feelings. Pride, fear, love. It's a wonder the world manages to stay as peaceful as it does." And with that, she turned back toward her cottage, her silhouette small but unshaken against the wide, brightening morning. Chapter 17. Gossip on the Green. By mid-morning, Elmsworth Village Green was alive with whispers. It was as if spring itself had paused to listen. The sun glowed faintly behind pale clouds, the bakery bell jingled, and the scent of fresh bread mingled with scandal in the air. Word of Reverend Pembroke's confession had spread faster than butter on toast. And, as was so often the case, each retelling grew a little more dramatic. "He pushed him in cold blood," declared Mrs. Dunley at the post office queue. "No," insisted Mr. Perks, the grocer. "It were self-defense. The Reverend's always been a fine man." "I heard," whispered Mrs. Sims from behind her knitting, "that the vicar's wife was there too and fainted on the spot. At the edge of the green, sitting under the elm tree with her modest blue hat and a basket of mending. Miss Marple listened to it all. Her eyes twinkled, not with amusement, but with the faint melancholy of one who has seen how swiftly truth becomes entertainment once danger has passed. "Seems terrible, doesn't it?" said Mrs. Hargreaves, plopping down beside her. "Poor Mrs. Pembroke. I can't imagine what she must be feeling." Miss Marple nodded, threading her needle. "Yes, quite terrible. And yet, one must be careful about sympathy. It's sometimes misplaced when all the facts are not yet known." Mrs. Hargreaves blinked. "Not yet known. But it's over, isn't it? He confessed." "Ah," said Miss Marple softly. "Confession and truth are not always identical twins. Sometimes they only resemble one another, from a distance." She looked across the green, watching Constable Owens talk to Inspector Graves near the inn. Both looked weary. Graves gestured toward the church, his brow furrowed, as if something in the case still troubled him. Miss Marple's gaze drifted back toward the road that led past the old bridge. A cart had stopped there, and a few curious boys were pointing at the water, shouting about bits of paper caught against the reeds. She stood slowly. "Excuse me, Mrs. Hargreaves. I think I'll take a short walk before luncheon." Down by the river, the air was damp and cool. The water shimmered with faint light where it slipped under the arch of the bridge. Near the edge, a boy ran up holding a scrap of soggy parchment. "Look, ma'am. We found this floating near the stones." "Thank you, my dear," said Miss Marple kindly, taking it with her gloved fingers. She unfolded it carefully, and frowned. It was another page of writing, matching the torn blackmail note she had discovered earlier. But this one was different. It bore a second name, written in the same neat, dark hand. "Mr. Vale is equally responsible, and shall answer with you both if the sum is not met." Miss Marple's lips tightened. "You both. The Reverend and Vale. Not the Reverend and his wife." She looked up, her eyes narrowing slightly as the last puzzle piece began to settle into place. That afternoon, she visited Inspector Graves at the small police office near the green. He rose at once. "Miss Marple, you've heard the news, of course. The vicar's confession checks out with most of the evidence. Case seems fairly tied." "Fairly," said Miss Marple gently, "but not neatly. And murders, even accidental ones, seldom rest comfortably when something is untidy." Graves frowned. "You mean the wife." "No," said Miss Marple. "I mean Mr. Vale, the man whose ledgers began all this. Tell me, Inspector, when the vicar was taken into custody, did Vale show much surprise?" "None at all," the inspector admitted. "In fact, he seemed relieved." "Ah," Miss Marple murmured. "That's always the trouble with relief. It tends to appear just before exposure." She laid the damp scrap of paper on his desk. "Read that carefully, Inspector. You may find that this tragedy began with a blackmailer, and will end with one." As she stepped back onto the green, the afternoon bells chimed across Elmsworth, warm and golden. Mrs. Hargreaves was still gossiping by the bakery window, and Miss Marple smiled faintly. People would soon say the case was solved. They always did. But she knew that until Mr. Vale's quiet, smug smile was gone from the village, and until all the money trails had been properly traced, the shadow under the old bridge would not truly lift. Chapter 18. The Book of Accounts. The next morning dawned gray and still, a thin fog curling low over Elmsworth, softening the edges of the cottages and muffling the bells of St. Mildred's. Miss Marple rose early, as was her habit, and had already finished her tea by 7:30. The vicarage, she knew, was now under police guard, and the Reverend sat in a small cell 2 streets away, his confession signed and sealed. Yet something in her heart resisted the neatness of it all. At 8:30, she walked toward Vale's accounting office, a squat brick building behind the butcher shop. The brass plaque by the door gleamed in the mist. Arthur Vale, Chartered Accountant, EST 1909. The shutters were half closed, and only a thin stripe of light showed across the front desk. She tapped gently. Mr. Vale himself appeared, tall, lean, impeccably combed as always. Miss Marple, I must say you're up early for gossip. Not gossip, Mr. Vale, she said pleasantly. Truth, which, as you must know, is far more valuable. He gave a short, uneasy laugh. You sound like the inspector. I've told them all I know. I'm sure you have, she replied, though perhaps not all you remember. He frowned slightly. What do you mean? Miss Marple smiled, walking past him toward the desk. May I? Without waiting for permission, she gently brushed her hand over the ledger book that lay open there. Numbers tell stories, Mr. Vale. They whisper, though only to those patient enough to listen. The accountant stiffened. Those are confidential records. Indeed. But so were the Reverend's donations, were they not? He said nothing. Miss Marple turned a page. Her eyes fell upon a series of small entries, each under the name Hollis Trust, each for the same sum, £10, withdrawn monthly. But in the margin, in tiny script, she noticed something odd. B.O.B. She tapped it. The old bridge, I think. Vale's jaw tightened. Merely shorthand for the ledger reference. Or perhaps for a location, Miss Marple interrupted softly. A meeting place where certain exchanges occurred? Between the Reverend and his benefactor. He stepped back, pale now. That's absurd. The Reverend was a desperate man. Gambling debts, I'm sure. Not quite, said Miss Marple, her voice calm but piercing. The Reverend was a frightened man. Because you, Mr. Vale, held every secret of every household in Elmsworth, and you decided to turn that knowledge into income. He laughed suddenly, a sharp, brittle sound. Do you have proof, Miss Marple? Or only one of your country theories? She folded her hands. Proof enough to ruin you socially, if not legally. The note found by the bridge, written in the same ink you use in these ledgers, named you alongside the Reverend. It seems you were partners once. But blackmail, Mr. Vale, is a lonely business. Sooner or later, someone must pay too high a price. He glared at her. You have no idea what that man was like. Always so pious, always so ready to judge. He thought himself untouchable. But when his own sins came due, he begged me to stop. I only asked what was owed. Miss Marple sighed softly. And when he could not pay, you went to meet him by the bridge. There was an argument. He fell, or perhaps you helped him along. For a moment, the office was silent except for the ticking of the wall clock. Then Vale whispered. He slipped. I swear it. I never meant. She closed the ledger gently. Confessions are quite the fashion in Elmsworth these days, aren't they? When she left the office, the mist had begun to lift. A shaft of sunlight touched the rooftops, pale and fragile. Miss Marple paused at the corner and looked back once. Through the window, Vale sat motionless, his hands pressed to his face. She knew he would not run. Men like him seldom did. They stayed, calculating even the price of their own ruin. That evening, she returned to the police station. Inspector Graves met her at the door, a mixture of weariness and gratitude on his face. You were right, Miss Marple. We searched Vale's office after you left. Found letters, duplicates of the blackmail notes, all signed in his hand. Miss Marple nodded. Poor Reverend. It seems his confession was merely a reflection of guilt, not of the crime itself. Graves sighed. We'll release him in the morning. Vale's being held for questioning. Never thought I'd see a man undone by his own handwriting. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Oh, Inspector. It's always handwriting, in one form or another. Words, deeds, or choices. One can't hide their own style for long. That night, as the lamplight flickered across her small sitting room, Miss Marple sat with her knitting and tea, reflecting quietly. Elmsworth was peaceful again, or soon would be. But in her heart, she felt that peace was only the silence that follows truth. A truth that had waited, patient as the river beneath the bridge, for someone to finally listen. Chapter 19. A quiet visit to the vicarage. The following morning was unusually still. A soft drizzle hung in the air like a veil, muting every sound in Elmsworth. The cobblestones gleamed darkly. Chimney smoke drifted low and uncertain. At precisely 10 o'clock, Miss Marple walked up the narrow lane toward St. Mildred's vicarage. She carried a small basket of scones and marmalade, a peace offering, though she knew that peace would not come easily. The vicarage door opened before she could knock. Mrs. Pembroke stood there, pale but composed, her eyes rimmed with sleeplessness. "Miss Marple," she whispered. "How kind of you to come." "I thought perhaps," said Miss Marple gently, "a little company might be welcome after such an ordeal." Mrs. Pembroke stepped aside. "He's in his study. He hasn't spoken much since his release." The study was dim, smelling faintly of dust and candle wax. The Reverend sat by the cold fireplace, hands clasped, staring at nothing. His collar lay loose, his once steady face drawn with shame and fatigue. "Good morning, Reverend," said Miss Marple quietly. "I hope I'm not intruding." He looked up slowly. "Not at all, Miss Marple. You've done me a service beyond measure, though I fear gratitude is a poor substitute for repentance." Miss Marple took a seat opposite him, folding her hands neatly in her lap. "Repentance need not always come from guilt, Reverend. Sometimes it comes from grief." He sighed, eyes closing. "You know, then." "I know enough," she said softly, "that Mr. Vale used your charity accounts to extort others. And when you discovered it, you tried to protect those people, even at the cost of your own name." The Reverend nodded slowly. "It began so simply. A missing donation, a small discrepancy. Vale explained it away, and I, foolishly, believed him. But when I found the letters, the threats sent to widows, to tradesmen, even to my own parish clerk, I realized the depth of it. And I did nothing." "Because you feared scandal," Miss Marple said. "Yes," he admitted. "For the church. For my wife. For the parish. I thought silence would save them. But silence is a coward's virtue." Miss Marple watched him for a long moment. The ticking clock filled the room like a heartbeat. "You tried to reason with him that night by the bridge," she said quietly. "He refused to stop." He looked up, startled. "How did you?" "It is always the bridge, Reverend," she said kindly. "People go there when they wish to cross between what they've done and what they hope can be undone." He let out a shaky breath. "He laughed at me. Said if I didn't sign over the funds, he would ruin us both. He stepped too close. The banknotes fell. I reached for them. He slipped. It was over in seconds." "And yet you confessed," Miss Marple murmured. He nodded, voice trembling. "Because I had already sinned, through pride, through cowardice, through silence. I thought God might forgive a murderer more easily than a hypocrite." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "Perhaps he already has. You see, Reverend, goodness is rarely spotless. It's merely those who fall and then choose to rise, who carry true grace." He smiled faintly, the first trace of light in his face. "You speak as though you've seen much of sin, Miss Marple." "Oh," she said, almost playfully, "one sees quite enough of it in village life, disguised as kindness, charity, or the best intentions." They both smiled then, quietly, sadly, like two people who understood how frail and lovely truth could be. When Miss Marple left the vicarage, the rain had ceased. The village green shimmered, clean and bright, and a robin hopped near the church gate. She paused to look back at the house, a humble, weary building now beginning, perhaps, to heal. And as she walked home, she thought of the old bridge again, and how many secrets had been carried beneath its stones, washed gently away by time and conscience. Chapter 20. The Last Ledger. 2 days later, Elmsworth Village had begun to breathe again. The bakery queues were longer, the milk cart clattered down High Street, and even the postmaster had resumed his habit of humming out of tune. To most, the whole dreadful affair was already becoming a story, something to whisper about over buttered toast. But Miss Marple knew the truth was still incomplete. It always was just before the end. That afternoon, Inspector Graves arrived at her cottage with a thick folder tucked beneath his arm and a weariness that tea could only half cure. He set the folder down on the small lace-covered table. "Miss Marple," he said, "I thought you'd like to see this before it goes into the official report." "Ah," she said, pouring him a cup. "The final chapter, as it were?" He smiled faintly. "You might say that." Inside the folder lay a series of receipts and bank drafts, all signed by Mr. Vale. The amounts varied, but each was marked Hollis Trust, the same as in the ledger Miss Marple had seen. Graves tapped one paper. We went through his accounts line by line. It wasn't just blackmail money. There's something odd here. Look at this date. Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles. April 10th. And this one, May 12th. Both payments, same amount. Yes, said Graves. But both paid out, not received. Vale was sending money, not collecting it. Miss Marple blinked slowly. Sending it. To whom? Graves flipped to the last page. To a small address in London. A boarding school. The name listed is and Pembroke. For a moment Miss Marple said nothing. The rain pattered softly against the window. Mrs. Pembroke's sister, she said at last. Or rather, her daughter. Graves looked surprised. Daughter? Miss Marple's tone was gentle but certain. I've lived long enough to notice when affection between mother and niece runs deeper than claimed. There was a scandal once before Mrs. Pembroke's marriage, hushed up as such things often are. Vale must have discovered it through parish donations or letters. She traced the ink with a gloved finger. He used that knowledge to blackmail the vicar. Not for greed, but to protect the girl's identity, to keep her schooling discreetly funded. The Reverend paid quietly to ensure no one ever knew. Graves exhaled slowly. So all this began to save a child's reputation? Miss Marple nodded. Yes. And to preserve a woman's dignity. What began as cruelty turned, in his own conscience, into a kind of desperate charity. The inspector leaned back. I'll be damned. Not damned, Inspector, Miss Marple corrected softly. Simply human. That's quite enough punishment for most. She looked out toward the green, where children were playing in the weak afternoon light. The bridge took a man's life, she murmured. But perhaps it also saved another's. As Graves rose to leave, he hesitated at the door. You know, Miss Marple, sometimes I think you see the world in a way none of us policemen ever could. Oh, not at all, she said modestly. I simply notice the things other people prefer not to, the small kindnesses hidden inside mistakes. He smiled, tipping his hat. You'll make this place quiet again. Not quiet, she said, but peaceful, that will do. That evening, Miss Marple took her customary walk along the lane by the river. The water glimmered under a pale sunset, the reeds whispering softly. She stopped on the bridge, that old patient witness to everything, and laid a single wildflower on its stone rail. For secrets kept, she murmured, and for truths finally told. Then she turned homeward, her steps slow and steady, the faint sound of church bells following her into the dusk.